How are you guys doing today? Back in session with Professor P. Today we're going to be talking about social stratification, class, ethnic identity, and race. Make sure you bring out your concept sheet so we can follow along on the sheet, all right? I'll be going concept by concept. I hope you guys are all staying safe and healthy. All right, let's start out with the term social stratification and so being socially stratified. Basically, we're talking about groups that have unequal access to the three advantages. In our society, we're very socially stratified. Everybody's in a different class system, right? Whether you're upper class, middle class, we're in a different class system, right? Everything is unequal. We have unequal access to the three advantages. All right, let's talk about the three advantages. The three advantages are wealth, economics, or power and prestige. So we have wealth, economics, right? Power and prestige. Number one, wealth or economics can be defined by anything that has value within that society, whether it's land, special purpose money, general purpose money, cattle, whatever it is. The other one, power. Power is actually defined in many different ways. For this particular unit, it's defined as people having the ability to make other people do the things they do not want to do under threat. For example, I have no power in this anthropology class unless I put a gun to your head and say, you better get an A on my exam, right? It's people are put in a position of threat, okay? The last one, prestige, is you're giving someone respect. All right, let's move on. We analyze these kinds of advantages, sometimes disadvantages, in relation to three kinds of societies. The very first one is called an egalitarian society. An egalitarian society is an equal access society. Nobody's above or below anybody. If anybody tries to rise in a society like this, they'll be killed or they'll be left behind. Remember the Hadza video. They were an equal access society. Everybody had everything. Nobody was above and below. They were a hunting and gathering society, right? They were a band society and they were nomadic. But let's just say you even have a local headsman in those societies. They don't have any real power and they don't have anything more than anybody else, okay? Everything is equal. Egalitarian means equal access society. All right, number two, a rank society. A rank society is like nobility. You have access, right, to wealth and power, but not prestige in a rank society, okay? A lot of times you guys think these go together. A rank society could be like a chiefdom. It could be nobility or aristocrats. A rank society is this. Ancestry. Your bloodline comes into play in a rank society. So let's just say I was the daughter of the chief. Then I could have all three. I could have wealth, power, and prestige. But let's say I was somebody that was a leather worker or someone who made weapons. I might have wealth, but I may not have power or prestige. Remember, in a rank society, the only thing off limits is the prestige. So let's just say I'm somebody in society that has wealth and I have power. But since I'm not related to the nobility or the chiefdom, I'll never have prestige. So you guys got to remember, with a rank, you could have equal access to wealth and power, not prestige. Prestige is linked through your bloodline, through your ancestry, through your heritage. All right, good. Now, a class society. We live in a class society. That means a class, everything is unequal. You guys understand that? So we're looking at wealth, power, or prestige being unequal. That's why some of you guys are in lower class, some are in middle class, some are in upper class, and even within these classes, there's division, right? You might be lower middle class or middle or upper middle. So even within this, a class is highly stratified, right? In the United States, this is what we have. Let's talk about an open class society. This is a society where people could move in the classes, between the classes, out of the classes, right? There's been a debate in the United States, are we an open class society, right? And we would have debated this if we were in class, right? But one of the things that we talk about is a lot of people, even though we are in an open class society and there is mobility, most people stay in the class that they're born into, right? Most people don't move out of that class. And as you know, it's much easier to move down in our society than it is to move up. A lot of you will use laziness, or you'll say, well, you're just not working hard enough. But what happens to people who work really hard, but they don't move up and out? Some people are going to be born with advantages that others are not going to be born with. Some of you guys have network systems that might help you a little bit more. Education really is one of the true ways to move out of your class and move up. But again, that's also stratified. Not many of you are going to get the same amount of education or have the same opportunities to education, right? So when we talk about an open class system and an open class society, we're really talking about the mobility, which we do have mobility in our system, but we have to understand factors are going to come into play that are going to prevent us from that mobility sometimes, right? So it's important to understand that. Now, if you look at your concept sheet, skip the other term, closed class. Let's get to classlessness. Ember and Ember talk about this concept of classlessness because we all put ourselves in middle class in the United States. One of the things I always ask my students when we're in the classroom setting is, what class would you put yourself into and why, if it wasn't always related to money? What class do you feel that you belong to, right? If you're in middle class, is it because where you live? Is it because the opportunities you have? Is it because you have all your wants and your needs met, or just some of those? So it's really a time to evaluate and critically think about what class you would put yourself into, right? And how you feel. That becomes important. That's why Ember and Ember says we have such a large amount of middle class in the United States that are we becoming that classless society? In most third world countries, there's only a bottom and a top. They have very little middle, and there's no middle most of the time. That becomes important to understand. All right, let's get to a caste system. A caste system is a system where you're born into it, you die into it, you marry into it. There is no mobility in a caste system. Okay, a caste system is a closed system. Within a caste, it becomes important because you have to stay within the structure of your own caste. In the book, they use the example of India. They look at the Brahmins and the untouchables, and the Brahmins were the upper caste. They sort of controlled all access to the advantages. The untouchables were literally untouchable. They, worked with the defecation. They worked with the cattle, and they were literally untouchable. So they actually even spoke a different dialect. They would have to nod their heads if a Brahmin came by. The Brahmins really were the priestly, the sort of the nobility caste, and the untouchables were not. It really had to do with the concept of contamination. It does have to sort of sink in with also religious ideologies. Even though the caste has been abolished, they still really abide by that caste system, right? So, and lots of different areas do have a caste, but with India, that's the example they use in the book, so we're going to stick with that example. All right, turn your page to slave and slavery. Why did they use this within this chapter? One of the things that Ember and Ember tried to do is they tried to give you a variety of different concepts of slaves that even people in Nigeria historically, Nigerians owned slaves, but they were able to marry out of slavehood and own businesses, right? And really acquire access to the three advantages. In our society, as you know, that was quite different. Raiding, Africa and then bringing people and defining them as slaves to sort of control their labor and really to justify concepts of racism, right? And really oppress people. But really the definition that they're talking about in here is that slaves represented a class that did not own their own labor, all right? The next term, manumission, was just granting freedoms to slaves. And it varied depending on the society that had slaves. It wasn't just the United States, but varied. So that becomes important. One of the things that is not in the Ember and Ember, but in your book are ancient classifications. Why do we classify people? It was very, very old, this concept of classifying people and putting them into sort of boxes, right? And we talked about that in the beginning of the semester, sort of leave your box, your negative box at the door. But in ancient Egypt, right, 3000 BC this started. In ancient Egypt, they came up with 4 categories. It was very simplistic. It was 4 categories of colors, and then it sort of defined a people. So let me give it to you. 3000 BC in Egypt, they had red. Red was for Egyptians. Red was the color you wanted to be, right? Yellow were people from the east. White were people from the north. Black was Africa. Very simple, sort of schematic, right? Color schemes. The second concept there, Hippocrates coming up with the four humors. Hippocrates was a Greek philosopher, a Greek medical specialist, and Hippocrates comes up with these four humors: air, earth, water, and fire. Air, earth, water, and fire. He says a Greek has equal proportions of all, 25% of each of those. That makes them a perfect human being. He says everything else was sort of non-human because they had unequal proportions of the humors. Okay. What's interesting about this is it really led into like personality disposition. I mean, it really, if we get into it deeply, it deconstructed a lot of things when we talk about the humors. For this course, right, we're just getting into the sort of the introduction of what these humors were about. But again, classifying people and putting people, on a lower standard. All right. Carolus Linnaeus comes up with taxonomy. Carolus Linnaeus put people into these boxes and in these categories, and he assigned them color, but then he assigned them like characteristics. So he said Europeans were white, but they were gentle, creative, inventive, intelligent, right? Things like this. Quite interesting. In this taxonomy, he says yellow was for people of the East, and they needed partial regulation. So they weren't all that bad, but they needed partial things. He says for blacks, right, from Africa, right, they were unintelligent, right? All of the racist ideology, unintelligent, uncivilized, right, not hardworking, again, leading into oppressive behavior. All right. The Enlightenment philosophies. Enlightenment philosophies came out of the school of like Jefferson and Franklin. And basically with Enlightenment, what was quite interesting about Enlightenment is that Enlightenment philosophers, there was a lot of racism, but they believed that racists should stick to themselves. That people, if they were going to intermix, or they called interbreed, that it would sort of dilute civilization, right? So again, a lot of this racist ideology. Joseph Gorbigneau was the creator of the Aryan Nation. Joseph Gorbigneau was a Frenchman. And interesting about Joseph Gorbigneau is he didn't look like the Aryan Nation, right? He had darker skin, darker hair, darker eyes. And he wrote The Inequality of Races of Humanity. In The Inequality of Races of Humanity, basically, it had these higher traits and lower traits, these good qualities and bad qualities. And he put people into these categories. And basically, The Inequality of Races of Humanities, Adolf Hitler got a hold of, and he used that book to justify the genocide against the Jewish nation. He justified genocide and ethnocide and all of these bad things that happened to the Jewish people. Fascinating about this and horrific was that Joseph Gorbigneau, was everything opposite of the Aryan Nation. So it's quite important to sort of understand that. But again, they wanted people to keep to themselves. They thought people had these lower traits and then would, again, dilute civilization and sort of wash it down a bit. Eugenics. Eugenics was a mass sterilization program. Sterilization was when they would take out a woman's reproductive organs. Eugenics was happening all the way up into the 1920s, funded by the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. And as late as the 1920s, women of color were actually sterilized, right? What's interesting about eugenics and the eugenics policy was that the Carnegies and the Rockefellers came up with this policy and said, you know what? For the eugenics, we're going to sterilize people who are alcoholics, people that are handicapped, people, that have drug addiction, people who are pedophiles. They put all these people into this big lump, which was unethical in and of itself, right? But when people went back to analyze the eugenics policy, they were only sterilizing women of color. Again, following their racist agendas. All right, race. The concept of race and racism is really a term where people believe they're superior to another race and a race is inferior to them. Race is a social construct. Nobody is born a racist. It is not biological. Even in science, you can't really analyze race We're all the human race. Biologically, we're all similar. We are one species that could reproduce, right, and have viable offspring. The concept and the term race came out of studying variant bird species. And then somebody decided we need to, look at phenotype, which is looking at skin color and someone's outer phenotypical characteristics. It can't be done scientifically. So it's very hard to categorize people and look at this concept of race. Race is social. Racism is taught. Racism is learned. Racism is passed on. Okay? And so it's something we need to understand. It's not anything biological. All right. One of the things, we're going to skip the next couple terms on our concept sheet. We're going to get down to hypodescent concept and the one drop rule. Hypodescent concept is a concept that we talk about, and it's a very old concept, where people of two different so-called races, if they mate and have offspring, the offspring is typically given the lowest status race. Example, Anglo married to a Latino, the child would be given the Latino race. African American and white, the child would be given the African American race. The one drop rule is a term that only specifically applies to African American people, where it's this sort of myth or this term that says if you have one drop of black blood, it determines your blackness. Those are their words, not mine. So it's that concept. Remember, 1% of black blood, 8% of black blood, 10% of black blood deems you black. Remember, these are all put upon people. In anthropology, we believe you could choose your own identity, but people put these things on people, okay? Hypodescent concept is not specifically African-American. One drop rule is this myth about, determining your blackness. One drop of black blood will deem you black. All right. The last term on here is ethnicity. Ethnicity is just people who share a common background. They share a common culture. They share a common history. They share a common religion. They may even share common geography. They may share common background. But there's pros and cons about an ethnic identity. An ethnic identity could be Latino, Asian, right? It could be African American. But there's pros and cons about it. The good thing and the pro about it is that you may share a common identity. You may have common language. You may have a common culture. You may be part of a group that you could turn to. The cons about that is you're homogenized again into being just Latino. So it doesn't sort of embrace that you're Mexican or that you're Guatemalan or Brazilian or Chilean. It's just like saying Asian, that you lump every Asian together, Chinese, Vietnamese, Lao, Korean, all of these, you lump everybody together again. So there's positive things about being part of an ethnic group, but then there's negative things about the homogenizing of a group again. All right. I hope that you guys enjoyed the chapter on social stratification, race, and identity. We'll be back for another lesson with Professor B. See you soon. Stay healthy and happy.